Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is a book club episode presented by your brothers in Christ, Nick and Peter, from the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Just as a reminder, after this episode, check out our show notes for a link to today's book so you can order yourself a copy of Dr. Andrew T. Walker's Liberty for All, Defending Everyone's Religious Freedom in a Pluralistic Age, published by Baker and Brazos Press. And there's also a link to our network of the Society of Reformed Podcasters and a link to the North American Presbyterian and Reformed Churches, as well as one for our Baptist brothers and sisters to find a church near you. And again, for today's book, we have Dr. Andrew T. Walker. He'll be talking to us about his book, Liberty for All. And it's published again by Baker and Brazos Press. So I'll hand it off to Peter.
Yep. So thanks, Andrew T. Walker, Dr. Andrew T. Walker, for coming on. He's the Associate Professor of Christian Ethics and Apologetics, Associate Dean of the School of Theology, and director of the Carl F. H. Henry Institute for Evangelical Engagement. So he's got quite a title. Joined the faculty at Southern Seminary in 2019, previously held a senior fellow in Christian ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and his calling as a professor is defend and advance the moral witness of the gospel. He's got a bunch of other stuff, married, has a couple kids, speaks all over the nation on issues related to Christian ethics, lay leader at his local church. But we're super thankful for this book and what it is, especially in today's day and age with what the church is going through, society is going through. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Walker.
Yeah, guys, it's good to be with you all. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. We both really enjoyed the book. It's very practical, like Peter was saying.
And very needed, I think, especially in today's Christian world, where I think Christians are very confused on how in the world does culture and the church interact.
Yeah. So with that said, it's, whether we're facing more temptation to push back and try to be an extra Christian government or society, or kind of where do we go from how to let the government do its job and how the church does its job. So you really explain it very well. And so my first question was, what was the background behind the purpose of writing this book, and who is it intended for? What is your overall arguments and thesis?
Yeah. So, the book, just to be full disclosure, the book is an adaptation of my dissertation, which I wrote at Southern Seminary. And I obviously, you guys have read it. It's not as dull as a dissertation sounds. So
yeah, thank you for that.
The verbose academic garbage that, only academics care about. But the genesis in writing it is, I kind of came, my career began during a lot of these conflicts around religious liberty and social conservatism. And obviously I'm a Baptist, and religious liberty is really central to the Baptist tradition as far as our ecclesiology and our history. And as I was thinking about issues to do a dissertation on, I had one idea around Carl Henry and the natural law, which I was really passionate about, but then just realized I don't think there's enough there to do a full dissertation on. And then got turned on to the religious liberty issue because I was doing that issue professionally, talking about it in the context of life, marriage, and religious liberty, or life and marriage. But I was doing all this reading in the area of how people had talked about and conceived of religious liberty, both from within the Baptist tradition and in the broader Christian tradition, and really kind of came to the conclusion that there have been a lot of piecemeal arguments made theologically and biblically for religious liberty, but no one, to my knowledge, up to my book, and I know that sounds kind of audacious, but no one has systematized how to think about religious liberty in categories that you would relate to systematic theology and into public theology and then to applied ethics. And so the whole purpose of the book was to lay out what does an evangelical doctrine of religious liberty look like? And I situate it in a broader conversation in terms of it's a core component to our public theology. But I also reframe the religious liberty issue. The book is not a book of culture war issues. You guys know that, you read it. It's much more theoretical.
Yeah.
And I almost think of religious liberty as much as a discussion about the relationship between eternal authority versus temporal authority. And that's a macro level issue that we need to think about as Christians. And so from that overarching discussion about the jurisdictions of authority, you get a doctrine of religious liberty. So what I did in the book, as far as my overall thesis, I said that religious liberty is not an accident of history. It's not a contingency of history. It has developed over time in terms of how it has been formulated and practiced, which I think is fine, because religious liberty doesn't have a granular form in Scripture as far as how it ought to look like. But there are principles of religious liberty, and I think those principles are derived around the categories of eschatology, anthropology, and missiology. And we might dig into those three categories more as we go, but the reason I wanted to talk about religious liberty in those three categories was in my dissertation research, I was looking at the work of Jay Badachevsky, who's a political philosopher at the University of Texas. And he said that any good political theory, and I kind of then applied this to social ethics and public theology. He said any good political theory is going to have three components. It's going to have an orienting doctrine, a practical doctrine, and then a cultural apologetic. And so what I did in the book was I tried to make the argument that the eschatological component is the orienting doctrine, essentially the doctrine that helps us understand religious liberty as a vertical idea between God and man. Then the practical doctrine was the anthropological domain of the book, helping us understand what does this mean for the actual outworking of religious liberty for us as human agents, having been made in God's image. And then the cultural apologetic sphere that Badachevsky talks about, I applied to the missiological domain. So, the apologetical domain asks, why is this persuasive? Why do you care? Why use this? And so I argue in the book that one of the reasons we should care about religious liberty is it's tied to our understanding of the gospel going forward. Now, I don't mean that simply on a legal basis. We believe that God is going to grow his church in his sovereignty according to his will, and that's going to happen even in the most hostile environments. Mm-hmm. But that does mean that when you understand the nature of evangelism, the nature of proclamation, the nature of sharing our ethics with the broader world, that entails aspects critical to our missiology. So I'm going to stop right there. Otherwise, I will keep going for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah, I have maybe a defining question too. So you talk about religious liberty and pluralism. I'm going to guess some people who've heard those two terms either have some weird definitions about it or might need some help understanding. Are you talking like, should we be pluralistic as Christians, or like, what do you mean by pluralism itself?
Yeah, no, good question. There's so much confusion around that term, and it sounds like you're arguing for relative. Yeah, exactly. Downplaying the differences. What one of my professors called the bomb fog, brotherhood of man, fatherhood of God. We're all God's children. There's no distinction between the religions. That's not what I mean whatsoever. When I talk about pluralism, I'm talking about both a political pluralism in the sense that nation states have to figure out how to have difference, figure out how to live with other different people peaceably and coexist. But then also, I do make a theological argument for pluralism. And I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying pluralism as in relativism. What I'm trying to make the case is, and this applies to the eschatological domain of the book, is when we look at the age right now that the church is in, we're living in between ascension and second coming. Mm-hmm. This paradigm of already not yet eschatology. Yeah. I would argue, and also based on my understanding of the Noahic covenant, we are living in an era where unbelief and rebellion is normative. Now, it's lamentable All of us want people to come to a saving knowledge of Christ, but it's normative in the extent that we are to expect in this age people to not agree with us and to not believe in the gospel.
Yeah.
And then how do you address those who disagree with us? Well, I think you do that through persuasion and non-coercion. I also, when I look at the eschatological component, I understand that I don't see the conscience as being something within the domain of judgment for the state. The conscience is going to be judged, but it's going to be judged by Christ, because Christ has authority as king over the conscience. I believe Christ as king has delegated his authority to the state on certain matters pertaining to issues that the state has jurisdiction over. I don't think it has jurisdiction over the conscience. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that anyone can do what they want under the guise of religion.
Yeah.
I'm pretty explicit that no, you don't get a blank check to commit whatever sin you want just under the guise of religion. There are deliberative bodies in place to help figure out what are those laws that help balance free exercise alongside issues of public health and public safety. But pluralism is simply a recognition of the age that we live in. And so we have to understand, if there is difference, and difference is to be expected, how do we respond to the nature of that difference? And what we have seen through history is where religion and politics have fused with one another, it's had bad outcomes for both the purity of the faith itself, and also it's had disastrous consequences for religious minorities. And I think we're in a healthier society where you have constitutional frameworks and procedures in place that allow us to solve debates through the ballot box, not with bullets.
Yeah. And thank goodness Joe Biden does not represent Christianity. You know what I mean?
No, that's exactly it. So if you invest the magistrate with this almost quasi mediatorial understanding, I don't want Joe Biden giving me catechetical instruction on anything.
Or any politician.
Or any politician.
Not even just Joe Biden.
I mean, that's exactly right. I don't want Mitt Romney to do that, and I don't want Joe Biden to do that.
Yeah.
Mitt Romney is a Mormon, and Joe Biden doesn't even believe most of what his Catholic magisterium teaches.
Right.
Yeah.
So that raises the question: can magistrates exist rightfully in office who aren't Christians? And I believe the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
I would rather have had Winston Churchill in office in England, who was pretty explicitly anti-Christian, then I would have had a naive Christian who simply wanted to play nice with Hitler. I just don't look at Scripture and think that the office of magistrate is exclusively bound to the idea that it needs to be a Christian in that office. And if it's not to be a Christian, or I'm sorry, if a non-Christian can rightfully be in that office, that has implications for what that office ought to be teaching us about religion.
Yeah. And another thing I was kind of getting from this conversation and the book is it reminded me extremes on both ends are really bad. So like on the far, far, far left, you have oppressive secularism.
Yep.
And on the far, far, far right, which would be the church and state molded too much together
Christian
for like a theocracy. So to sum it up, the gospel should not be moved forward by the sword. Obviously, that's going to do more detriment. I mean, the government messes up enough. We don't need it to mess up also our Christianity.
To run basic healthcare websites. Why would you trust it with the Trinity?
That's true. Yeah.
I know.
I would want to give them the church.
And then, and then on the far left side, you don't want to have secularism be so aggressive and hateful towards religion, where it's saying that it's trying to destroy it altogether. It should be the government's there to protect us, to allow us to have the church do what it needs to do. It's kind of hands-off approach. So
yeah, and in the book, I warn against what I call both like kind of theocracy, but then also what I call seculocracy.
Yeah,
there we go.
Because my understanding of the nature of the Imago Dei is everyone is religious, whether they consider themselves religious or not.
Yeah.
So in both seculocracy and theocracy, they both operate from the twin pillars of one thing, and what they have in common is this idea of immanentizing the eschaton. In a theocratic understanding, it's that you can bring kind of heaven to earth, so to speak.
Yeah.
But then also in a seculocracy, you have the totalitarian impulse of trying to enact your perfect vision for society. But if that's defined solely on material terms, what do you do with people in your society who have a different conception of the true and the good and the beautiful, not defined strictly by materialism? Well, you eliminate them, which is why when totalitarian regimes get into power, what do? They go after religion.
Yeah.
Whether Russia, whether North Korea, they view Christians and religion as impediments to their understanding of their perfect paradise-oriented social vision.
Yeah.
And they ends up becoming inimical to liberty in the long run. And that's in the book, I make this weird argument, and I know I'm living in tension and in paradox, and it's where I expect to actually get criticized quite a bit. Is I more or less say I think liberal democracy is the worst form of all tried experiments of government, except for all the others.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then at the same time, the current trajectory of liberal democracy, I think, is unsustainable.
Yeah.
And if you're asking me, do I think religious liberty has a bright future in America? No, I don't. Even if we have good Supreme Court rulings, which we have had of late, the Supreme Court is only as good as the culture behind it. And so what happens now isn't to say what's going to happen 30 or 40 years from now.
Yeah.
And I don't have optimistic dreams of religious liberty's viability, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. Is I think if we're going to have a retrieval and recovery of religious liberty, I think it's going to be the Christians who are the ones who are going to do it. If you're not a Christian and you believe society ought to be organized around your idea of perfection, how do you make a principled case for those who disagree with you?
Yeah.
You can't. And the reason Christians can is because we believe judgment is not ours. We believe in a transcendent horizon, not an ultimate horizon, not the state has right over penultimate matters, not ultimate matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has a very and you correct me on this identity, but I feel like it's got a very two kingdom approach of flavor. Or you can, kind of put more emphasis on that or less, but it's we serve our ultimate king and ultimate authority on an eternal basis in God's kingdom. However, we're still citizens of this world in a temporal sense, being realistic that we live in still this already not yet fallen world where there are going to be finite people in charge of us. And so to be biblical, to submit to those authorities. So I kind of wrap that up, but I know we talked about the three main sections: eschatology, anthropology, and missiology. We also talked about why is religious pluralism so vital for us Christians, and how your book addresses what religious pluralism looks like on today and the future of the church's witness. How does preserving religious pluralism in the broader society actually help preserve and make distinctive of the gospel of Jesus? So how's this going to help point to the gospel of Jesus?
Yeah. So I think I would answer that by simply acknowledging that it is really for the gospel to be the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be coterminous or simply identified with the reigning political or cultural order.
Yeah.
There has to be distinction. And so if there is distinction, if there is an antithesis, one of the ways we manifest that distinction is by preserving the institutions and individuals who identify with that religion as saying, no, I'm this, not that. And because I'm this, I need a degree of liberty, both in my personal agency and also with my institutional agency, to come to exercise my faith, but also to exercise my faith in the context of the local body as we gather, because we understand as Christians, as citizens of the kingdom, but also as the church, which I think is a colony of the kingdom. We understand that that is not synonymous with the world. And so when we make those distinctions, we're actually clarifying who we are on the one hand, and we're actually clarifying who the mission field is on the other.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I guess to come full circle with that, by knowing who we are and knowing who the world is, that actually sets kind of the horizon for what the nature of that mission looks like within society. And it demonstrates, again, my liberty is bound up with the liberty of others. If I'm going to make the appeal for someone to come to Christ, the Muslim, I believe, has the right to make an appeal for me to convert to Islam. And that is hinged upon an important assumption that of a rejection of what I would simply call a monism, the idea that we're all simply one thing when it comes to matters of religion. We're not. And we need to be honest about that and state our differences clearly. And when we state them clearly and have systems that allow us to work out those differences peaceably, this gets back to the argument I make in the book that religious liberty ought to be seen as a vehicle of common grace. It's something that God gives us to prevent us from just completely killing each other over every little last difference that we come to have.
Yeah, I think you make the point well in your book, and maybe to draw out some implications that if we tie the gospel or our messages to the church with societal messages, whatever that is, A, that can change, but B, that the gospel, instead of being, for lack of a better word, is the call to obey Jesus, call to see him as the Son of God, and it becomes this more social project where we need to get things done on this planet that is seen as equal to the gospel.
Right.
And I think you make that point pretty well in your book, and maybe draw out some of the other question too. So like with this, trying to distinguish these two things and talk about religious pluralism and the right of religious pluralism, how does this look like? And I know your book is a little more theoretical, but how does this look like kind of on the ground in the church in relationship to society? With this understanding, especially for Christians, not just like those outside of the church, but as Christians with this book in hand, how do we see this book and then use this book within our society?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're asking me to get practical, which is hard for the academic to do. I think what I'm hoping to see out of this book is both a heightened call to care about culture. So it's a call to engagement with the world, but I would say rightfully subjugating the affairs of the world against the backdrop of the kingdom. And when we understand the kingdom's promise, that it's going to come on its terms, not necessarily by our pure agency, that helps us, and I say this carefully, it helps relieve us of the burden of trying to change the world, so to speak. I draw a lot on Jeremiah chapter 29, seek the welfare of the city.
Yeah.
And to me, that's an interesting, it's written when Israel is in exile, then the Peter picks that language up in 1 Peter chapter 2. you'll notice that the place of the Christian in society, I think, is far more restrained in society than it is triumphalistic or utopian in nature. So when they go into exile, what are they called to do? They're not called to take culture back for Christ, so to speak. That might happen. That might happen organically as an outworking of the gospel happening and transforming society, which I believe the gospel can transform society. But what we're instructed to do is build homes, have families, effectively just get involved in participation in creation.
Yeah.
And so when I think we as Christians understand that, for example, this day and age is meant to be fractured. It's meant to be defined by a degree of pluralism. Now, I do state in the book that pluralism only works so far. I do a lot of the natural law theory in the book. It only works so far as the natural law is, at least to some extent, minimally obeyed. And to the extent that it's not minimally obeyed, it's dangerous for society. And I do think that we're actually venturing into that area of danger.
Yeah.
But to me, religious liberty is a call to let the government do what the government is designed to do. It's to let families do what they're designed to do. It's to allow non-Christians to do what they're going to do, and to bring a degree of peace in civil society. I often talk about, I have people in my neighborhood here who I probably disagree with on some major issues. If I go to my understanding of society and disagreement in my neighborhood with an understanding of, okay, I disagree with them, I don't have to support the merits of their belief, but I can at least defend the rights of their conscience to grasp what it grasps. And if I can at least have some measure of goodwill and some measure of goodwill empathy, maybe they'll extend the same to me. Now, and maybe they won't.
Yeah.
And again, I my fear is in the book, I'm going to be accused of too cheerfully downplaying the antithesis and difference.
Yeah.
I fully anticipate a possibility of religious liberty completely collapsing in society if we keep going down the trajectory that we are. I have no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But I do believe we have an ability as Christians to talk about the fact that people are made in the image of God. Every single person is, I talk about the 3 A's of religious liberty. Everyone's living according to some authority. Everyone wants to adore, so everyone's worshiping that authority, and everyone wants to live with a degree of authenticity.
Yeah.
And everyone is doing that, non-Christian and Christian. Yeah. And so religious liberty helps kind of explain the lineaments of so much of how everyday common life occurs within a fallen age, and also gives us the ingredients to try to figure out how to solve those debates without bullets, ballot boxes.
In what you're saying, I think, is within a peaceful realm, as much as we can to handle peaceful, which the government to protect us in a certain way, people need to be allowed to, with their conscience, move forward with trying to exercise their beliefs and and find out if it's true or false without it being forced on them.
Right. So, I mean,
yeah, and you speak about that explicitly too, the ability to make that choice yourself.
Right. So, I mean, that gets to the very nature of religious liberty in terms of what its essence is. I can't believe for other people. People have to believe on their own terms.
Yeah.
All I can do is make good, powerful arguments. And then when I have come to grips with what I believe ultimate truth is, because I'm a self-constituting agent, I want to live in alignment with what I believe is true.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm not saying that's relativism, and we say everyone's pursuit of the truth, of their truth, is good. I hate those maxims of you do you, live your truth, that empty kind of relativism. All religious liberty says is people are self-constituting agents, and insofar as society, they're not causing a harm to society, we are going to let people live in accordance with their grasp of the truth, even if we believe their understanding of the truth is wrong. And there's a lot of confusion here. When we defend other people's religious liberty, we're not defending the merits of what they believe or defending how they live. We are defending the sincerity of their conscience, in the sense that their conscience thinks what they're believing or acting out is actually true. I can, and there are varying degrees of how to respond to that. On the one hand, you can engage in conversation and persuasion, and if the person is doing something so foul and so problematic, if the deliberative bodies decide it's necessary, they can restrict them, or even necessary, arrest them, if it's a true endangerment of the common good. But my simple presumption is, because we're made in the image of God, people are trying to make sense of their lives authentically. And to the extent that they are doing that non-violently, I think we should try to make space for people to abandon rebellious, erroneous belief non-coercively.
Yeah, that plays into my next question. I mean, pretty well. And so you don't draw the implications quite as much, but there's some seeds in it, and I think this is the opposite of what I just asked. I think it also helps answer this question as well with the thesis of your book. So what happens if or when religious pluralism is substituted for either some sort of like Christian reconstructionism, which you talk about a little bit, or some mandated religious observance? You can even go the opposite way of saying the secular theocracy arguments. What happens when either of those two extremes does occur, and we don't have religious pluralism, as you speak about in your book?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to have a secularist winter on the one hand, in terms of just eradicating a public square that's open to dissenting belief. I think on the theonomic side, in the same way, you're going to be using the state in heavy-handed ways to make people second-class citizens based on their false belief. And again, like I'm not trying to say this just to give a short answer. I think not only are there biblical and theological reasons why this is problematic, I just think historically, show me a time where hardcore secularism, like in the form of Soviet Russia, or where kind of theonomic-esque or theonomic adjacent manifestations of church and state, you think of maybe medieval Europe, where that worked well for either the purity of the church or the protection of religious dissent. I mean, the whole story of the development of the nation state is essentially learning to decouple religion from politics, because we learn when they fuse, there's bloodiness. That results.
Yeah, and I guess too, when religion and politics mix in this age, it's usually not religion that wins. It's politics uses religion
it's a political form of religion.
Yeah, it's used to weaponize instead of being the gospel, which is not a weapon in the physical sense, it's a weapon in the heart.
Right.
And if I may jump in with this comment, because I know where the listeners are probably thinking, they're, number one, the broadly evangelical, especially Americans, are thinking, and I thought this for a better part of my life, is that America is a Christian nation, which I think is totally a false comment, right?
Well, I would say how I would answer that is I don't think it's a Christian nation in the sense of it having any covenantal partnership with God.
That's what I mean.
I do think that America's origins were incontrovertibly shaped by a Christian moral framework, and I think that's a belief that even non-Christians would agree with. I mean, you look at a book like Dominion by Tom Holland. There's a non-Christian basically saying so much of what the West takes for granted is the result of a Christian moral foundation.
Totally.
And so it's a the buzzword of the day is Christian nationalism, right? The problem with that term is actual Christian nationalism that's trying to use Christianity as a prop for the state or to exclude others is problematic, or where you think that America has some unique role in the unfolding drama of redemption, that is problematic. The problem is Christian nationalism is kind of a weasel word at this point, where progressives, anything they don't like about Christianity, or conservative, just orthodox confessional Christianity, they accuse that of being Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
Well, if you feel compelled to get engaged in the public square, like I do, I mean, I'm directly involved in Kentucky in its political arena with the Kentucky Baptist Convention. I'm operating on the basis of my faith. Am I a Christian nationalist? No, I don't think that I am. I'm what I believe I'm doing is advocating for principles on the basis of justice, truth, goodness, and the common good, human flourishing.
Yeah.
That's beneficial for all, not just for Christians.
Mm-hmm. Amen. Thank you for touching on that.
Yeah, and that's helpful too. I think it's a term that gets thrown around today that's not well defined. Where if you are a Christian and you are in the public square, you can be accused of some of this stuff, versus seeing it as it's Christian nationalism in the true, like, definitional senses. You're weaponizing the states for your religious ideas,
right.
maybe. And that's good. And I think this conversation, this book is super needed today. And I know there's been some other works, and maybe kind of before we end this, how is this different from other works on natural law, moral order, some of this stuff that kind of undergirds society and distinguishes church and state? So how's your book, before we end this, different than some of those works?
I would say what's unique about my book is I'm utilizing what I would say is both an appreciation for covenantal theology and inaugurated eschatology, but then I'm also doing this within the framework of natural law. So Robert George wrote the foreword to the book. He's obviously a Catholic natural law scholar, a brilliant man, and kind of a mentor to me. And so, I hesitate to speak about my book in audacious categories, but I don't know of a book that has attempted to bring together both an eschatological, covenantal, and natural law understanding of religious liberty in one book. Mm-hmm. And so I would like to think that I'm breaking some new ground here, although every author thinks they're breaking new ground with their book. So maybe that's just a fool's answer.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to read as much as I can on natural law, and I think even if there are other books on some of this stuff, I think it's the most approachable book on the subject that people can read faithfully and not language that's too hard for them to understand. I think somebody who's barely new to the faith, somebody who doesn't know the faith, I think they can come to this without too much prior knowledge.
Yeah, I tried to write in such a way that someone would not need to have a seminary degree to read this book.
Yeah.
Nick, you survived the book and you didn't go to seminary, so I guess you're a living testament to the book.
That's right.
Yeah, I loved it. I love the topic. I think it's helpful for everyone. I think even a non-Christian reading this is edifying, because they can say, oh, cool, I might not believe what they believe religiously, but I can see how it's a safe and better society for all of us to allow all of us to kind of have that separation of church and state.
Yeah, in fact, I'm trying. I've got an op-ed that I'm trying to get placed in the New York Times. I don't know if it'll actually get placed or not, but I'm trying to make an argument like secularists ought to care about religious liberty too. And
yes,
be simply because the architecture of liberty itself, liberty presumes that meaning is derived not from the state. Now, some people might derive it from a more secular understanding or a religious understanding, but it's not derived from the state. And when the state gets involved, it's problematic. And so liberals, progressives, secularists, they ought to have some appreciation for these categories as well.
Yeah.
And I know we're really short on time, so I apologize, but there's this, I know this is a major kind of question, so you can keep it really short though, but I want to make a plug for it. But a lot of people are probably wondering, this is all great and good from a Christian perspective, but they're like, what if the state, the government oversteps their bounds? And how do I know when to essentially maybe fight back? Or, like Martin Luther King, he civil rights movement, he made an action towards to fight segregation. There's certain points where like, hey, we're not going to be docile. This isn't a time for me to be quiet. Like I need to stand up. How do we know when to do that?
Yeah. One of the tests for kind of civil disobedience, there's prudential discussion about whether Christians are mandated to violate unjust laws. And some unjust laws are different than unjust laws, or they're unwise laws versus unjust laws. But I think there is a consensus that where the state is asking you or mandating you to violate your conscience, that's where you would have a degree of justification for refusing to act. Now, to me, you also have to clear some other thresholds. Is this the last resort? Have you pursued alternate means to try to fix this and remedy this? And it's the whole notion of, if the state were to force you to perform an abortion, like there's just no circumstance which I would ever do that. It's like, I'm willing to pay the price for staying firm with my conscience. If I think a law is dumb, like we just passed tax week. Taxes are no fun. I don't feel as though I have the justification to not pay my taxes, even if I don't like them.
Yeah.
And even if I could argue that some of our tax monies go towards unjust things, I don't feel like I have the ability to say I can't pay my taxes.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. And kind of last question before we wrap up. So after reading this book, I mean, I know for me, I know for others who after reading this, and hopefully after listening to this, knowing this is a needed book for preserving natural law, all that stuff. And thanks for writing this in accessible ways. Do you have anything upcoming after this comes out? When this podcast comes out, this book will be 2 days old. Do you have anything kind of else up in the works that people can be looking forward to after reading this? Like, I want to learn more. This guy's helping me learn more about this.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of stuff. I just signed a contract to write a book, which will be like an evangelical natural law ethics volume. Huh. Come out until 2024, so still a ways away.
Okay, yeah.
Then next year, I just signed a contract with Crossway to do an evangelical, a volume, kind of doing, it's called Evangelicals Engaging Robert George, which is going to be a bunch of evangelical scholars kind of translating and analyzing Robert George's work in kind of evangelical categories. And then I'm also working right now on a large volume with Paul Miller of Georgetown and Tommy Kidd of Baylor on Baptist political theology.
Oh.
It's going to be an edited volume for that. And then I've got another popular level volume that I'm dreaming of a proposal on with a buddy of mine. And then I'm under verbal contract with Zondervan for a 5 views book on the natural law that I'm going to edit. Huh. So yeah, probably too much on my plate. So.
Yeah. That's great. Well, yeah, we'd love to have you on for those things and just talk about more of natural. I think this is such a needed conversation for a lot of Christians and non-Christians to talk about and wrestle through.
Yeah, happy to do that, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're on Twitter at Andrew T. Walker. Andrew T. Walk. So people can find you there. People can find you on the Southern Baptist website. I know you do some other stuff for other news sites, but yeah, go find them there. But thanks for coming on to our show, talking about your book.
Glad to be here, guys. Thanks.